Hello, everyone. This is Moderate Rebels Live. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal. Today, we're going to talk about big tech, a variety of different issues. In the past few weeks, we've seen several scandals related to Facebook, Google, and the publication of the Pandora Papers. You might have seen that people lost their minds this past week because Facebook, which owns Instagram and WhatsApp, went down for several hours. There were also major problems with other platforms, including apparently with Gmail. There were some issues. And now there's this so-called whistleblower from Facebook, which it's quite incredible to see the corporate media embracing a whistleblower. It reminds me of when in the Trump administration, there were these so-called whistleblowers. Well, actively, the most famous whistleblower, actual whistleblower on earth, Julian Assange, is being tortured in a high-security prison alongside so-called terrorists. So it's very suspicious for me whenever we see mainstream corporate media suddenly embrace a whistleblower. It's also reminiscent of a scandal we're going to talk today about, which was, do you all remember Cambridge Analytica? And there was supposedly this whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica. Well, it turns out that much of what he actually said, Christopher Wylie, ended up being totally debunked. And we'll talk about that today. We'll talk about the so-called Facebook whistleblower. And then we're going to talk about the Pandora Papers and how it seems more and more that U.S. spy agencies, intelligence agencies, spooks, and feds that throughout the world for so many years have carried out meddling operations and disinformation campaigns. Increasingly, those campaigns are coming back home. And more we see information war targeting domestic populations. A major Canadian newspaper just acknowledged that the military has been testing its propaganda campaigns, its information warfare techniques against its own domestic population. And increasingly, I think we see very similar campaigns in the United States. And the corporate media is, of course, a handmaiden. CNN is really pushing a lot of this coverage. So, Max, let's just begin. I want to talk at the beginning of this stream, because I know people have a lot of questions about this so-called Facebook whistleblower. It's all over the media 24/7 right now. She just testified in the Congress. CNN is doing constant coverage. And what is your take on this so-called whistleblower? And why is the media, after demonizing, constantly demonizing Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, actual whistleblowers, why all of a sudden does it care so much about this whistleblower?
Well, first of all, thanks for that excellent intro, and also for wearing the same shirt as me in the next live stream. We're both going to be wearing black berets, and we're going to strum folk tunes together. We'll be sitting on stools. And if we're Simon and Garfunkel, I think I'm Garfunkel because I have more male pattern baldness. But but that was a really good lead in to this discussion, and tying the Pandora Papers to the Facebook's quote unquote whistleblower. I mean, who absolutely makes a mockery of whistleblowers. If anyone watched my and Ben's stream about dissidents that are weaponized against official enemies, this whistleblower reminded me a lot of dissidents, particularly the official U.S. cultivated dissidents, especially Naira, in the way that she was so prepared and coached by the national security state and had been plucked almost out of nowhere in order to deliver a testimony that dovetailed so closely with the Democrats' censorship agenda that was rolled out, beginning with Hillary Clinton's first public statement after losing to Donald Trump, where she condemned fake news and called for its obliteration through a partnership between the government and big tech. That's obviously what Frances Haugen was carted in to do. And Frances Haugen, go search her on any search engine. Try to find her LinkedIn. It's locked. Her Twitter account is locked. Her Twitter account was immediately verified, which is a telltale sign that big tech has some kind of relationship with the forces that cultivated Haugen. She has almost no background that we can discern. The right wing claims that she was part of the civic responsibility team of Facebook that buried the story about Hunter Biden's laptop and prevented users from sharing the New York Post article about Hunter Biden's laptop at the tail as Biden and Trump entered the finish lane for the 2020 presidential election. It was one of the most overt cases of online censorship in order to tilt the race towards Biden. It was a shocking. I don't know if that's true. I just see it on right-wing sites, so you have to ask questions. But we have to ask questions about who this person is and what her agenda is. And she makes her agenda fairly clear in her opening statement, but she's kind of vague about what she wants to do. Essentially, she's calling for massive government oversight of Facebook and Instagram. And she's right that their algorithmic amplification of certain toxic sites is wrong and needs to be reined in. She's also right that Instagram encourages toxic self-images, particularly among young women. I mean, the whole culture of Instagram is absolutely disgusting. There's a reason that China's government has taken action against it because they don't want their society to be completely poisoned. But what is the agenda here? It seems to be much more far-reaching than simply limiting what Frances Haugen called anger-driven virality. And it's just about giving the government more ability to censor the internet as a whole and social media in particular. There is a desire among the our ruling elite now, and particularly those who identify with the left of center and the Democrats, to get rid of Section 230. Section 230 of the U.S. Code that was passed in the Communications Decency Act immunizes social media companies and internet hosting sites from lawsuits related to third-party content. So basically, if Section 230 is removed, and then somebody could, I mean, we talked about this on a previous show, Ben and I, about the insane lawsuit that we faced, a phony lawfare attack on us by a wealthy neoconservative heiress. Now, that lawsuit could have potentially been directed against any site, for example, WordPress for hosting us and hosting the Gray Zone, or YouTube for hosting this live stream, if Section 230 were removed. And that would mean that those sites, Facebook, YouTube, which is owned by Google, would begin removing all content that was too considered controversial, or open them up for further lawsuits. So they would self-regulate all inconvenient information out, which is actually something they might want to do anyway, because they're trying to get rid of smaller companies. And there would be this huge boon for online content moderation, which the government would directly participate in. So that's a huge red flag there. And then we see, and we should throw this video up, another telltale sign that Frances Haugen is not a whistleblower, but is actually a kind of, I mean, it might be too extreme to call her an intelligence operative, but she concludes her opening statement by mentioning that Myanmar and Ethiopia, which are two targets of US empire right now, are just the beginning, and that these countries or their governments are actually using Facebook to target their opposition, US-backed opposition. And then during Q&A, I think with Senator Richard Blumenthal, who is no relation to me, fortunately, and is a huge proponent of online censorship, one of the leading figures pushing for this, she goes in about China, or she levels allegations against China for using Facebook as an information weapon against the Uyghur population, which we've heard so much about for the last 2 or 3 years, and Iran using it as well. So she goes after 4 official U.S. enemies in very scripted fashion. Let's throw on some of this video if possible. I think it's very, very illuminating and disturbing.
So this is from her hearing in U.S. Congress. Here we go. Put the audio on.
What we saw in Myanmar and are now seeing in Ethiopia are only the opening chapters of a story so terrifying, no one wants to read the end of it. Congress can change the rules that Facebook plays by and stop the many harms it is now causing. We now know the truth about Facebook's destructive impact. I really appreciate the seriousness which the members of Congress and the Securities and Exchange Commission are approaching these issues. I came forward at great personal risk.
Yeah, right.
I believe we still have time.
Yeah, right. It was maybe a risk to like her LinkedIn account being looked at, but
yeah,
you know, this is the greatest dream for someone like Frances.
Yeah, becoming a mini celebrity. And to me, this is so revealing, this particular moment. Here is the CNN report, which, again, CIA News Network. That's what we're talking about. The Clinton News Network or the CIA News Network. Here's the headline. Terrifying. They begin with like this clickbait. Terrifying. Facebook whistleblower cites violence in Myanmar and Ethiopia, spying by China and Iran. Absolutely incredible. I mean, every country she mentioned is just go down like the list of targets and put a check next to every name. It's all of the countries that are targeted by Washington for regime change and destabilization. China, Iran, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Russia, you can go on. And for me, the fact that she mentioned Ethiopia out of all of them is so revealing, because Ethiopia is a new obsession of the Biden administration and the Antony Blinken State Department. This is a very new development. Of course, there have been hawks in the U.S. government demonizing China and Iran and Russia for decades, and Myanmar for over a year now with the coup and the regime change operation there, trying to reinstall the NED-backed forces in Myanmar. But Ethiopia has become like one of the pet projects of the Blinken State Department, and specifically of Samantha Power, the queen of R2P humanitarian intervention over at USAID. So the fact that Haugen mentions Ethiopia specifically is so suspicious, because no one in Washington, outside of those little bubbles, no one in Washington is just sitting there thinking about Ethiopia. There are, of course, all these neocons.
Well, no one outside of Washington. No one outside of Washington except Ethiopian diaspora folks.
Yeah. So, and people might be wondering why. I mean, Max and I did an episode about this. Ethiopia has become a major ally of China in Africa. It's the second largest population in Africa, a massively growing economy. Ethiopia signed a peace agreement with its neighbor Eritrea, which has been a target of U.S. regime change operations for many years. They're trying to work together to create this new kind of unified Horn of Africa that is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative in a strategic region. The U.S. is trying to destabilize all of this, try to kick China out of the region, try to prevent rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea and Somalia. And the Biden State Department, I mean, this did not begin with Trump. To be fair, this was all the Biden administration pushing this. And now we have this so-called Facebook whistleblower who's talking about why we have to censor the social media even more because of Ethiopia. It's so suspicious.
It's just a way of dropping Ethiopia and Myanmar. Nobody talks about Myanmar outside of kind of like spook circles. And as a commenter pointed out, this woman has like the jawline of a spook. Like she just has the vibes of a spook.
What does that mean? Like an Aryan jawline? I don't even
kind of like, you know, she comes out of a Tom Clancy novel and you know, she strides in. And she had really been prepared. I mean, I don't know if this is like well, it's not appropriate to say, but I'm just going to say it. Alex Rubenstein pointed it out that she had lost a lot of weight ahead of this hearing and had really undergone a real, I mean, it suggests a process of preparation was underway for this moment. And, you know, leaving her aside, this dovetails with a lot of events that we'll talk about, including the Pandora Papers, but also the Facebook outage, which she mentions. But before we get into that, can you throw up the clip of her talking about Uyghurs and Iran? It's also very suggestive.
Yeah. So here's a clip. This was, again, this is what it was at her congressional hearing. And
Yeah,
you
I
might have
tweeted
seen this
about
was,
it.
yeah, this was going around Twitter. So this is the so-called Facebook whistleblower Haugen here.
During my time working with the threat intelligence org, so I was a product manager supporting the counter espionage team. My team directly worked on tracking Chinese participation on the platform, surveilling, say, Uyghur populations in places around the world. That you could actually find the Chinese based on them doing these kinds of things.
So Facebook,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
We also saw active participation of, say, the Iran government doing espionage on other state actors.
The Iran government.
And I believe Facebook's consistent understaffing of the counter-espionage, information operations, and counterterrorism teams is a national security issue.
There we go. All of this. I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and say it. This entire hearing, all of this media propaganda, it was all built around getting that money quote right there. That's the money quote. That's the goal of her testimony. That's the goal of the congressional hearing. Listen to what she said here.
Information operations.
A little bit. Sorry, back more. Here we go. Listen to this quote.
This is definitely a thing that is happening. And I believe Facebook's consistent understaffing of the counter-espionage, information operations, and counterterrorism teams is a national security issue.
She says Facebook's supposed consistent understaffing of counter-espionage and counterterrorism operations is a national security threat to the U.S. government. So, of course, the solution is more censorship, more so-called counter-espionage work, and more so-called counterterrorism, which just means removing people who criticize U.S. foreign policy, removing people who can be deemed a so-called terrorist threat. I mean, it's blatant political censorship we're talking about, and that's what this is all about. And that's why she singled out Iran and China and Russia and Ethiopia and Myanmar, because they're saying that this is a national security threat, and that's all you have to say in Congress. It's a national security threat, and people turn off their brains and just do whatever you want.
Well, she's also calling for beefing up counter-espionage teams, which means Facebook has counter-espionage teams, and she wants to use Facebook as a espionage device controlled from Langley or Washington, controlled by the U.S., hiring spooks, active spooks, to work inside Facebook. That's what she's talking about here. And another point that I think I missed the first time I listened to that clip is she said the Iran government surveilling other state actors. And I actually, glossed over other state actors. Who's she referring to? She's talking about Israel.
Israel.
So this is coming from the Israeli intelligence services, that a comment like that would come from them.
That's exactly what I was thinking when she was speaking, and with all this media coverage. She talks about Iran, China, Russia, Ethiopia, Myanmar. Of course, there's no mention of the well-known Facebook Israeli intelligence operations in Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and Saudi and other U.S. allies. I mean, the censorship of Palestinians on Facebook is next level. I mean, probably of all the people in the world that are targeted for censorship, I mean, Venezuelans, Chinese, Russians are hit a lot. I know average Venezuelans who have been censored and called supposed state propaganda. It's absurd. But honestly, Palestinians probably face the worst censorship. And there's no acknowledgement whatsoever in this hearing or in any of the media coverage of the Israeli government's, the Israeli apartheid regime's use of Facebook and social media as a weapon.
Yeah. Israeli ministers actually began meeting with Zuckerberg and his staff before the Trump era, before the whole hysteria about fake news, in order to pressure them to censor Palestinian publications. And there was an open door policy, de facto open door policy for them. Of course, this is never talked about. Facebook has responded to this spectacle first by undercutting Haugen's credentials, claiming probably correctly that she was never involved in any of the programs she said she was, that she was a low-level figure. This would be consistent with some of the other whistleblowers that the U.S. government and permanent national security bureaucracy cultivated during the Trump era, like the NSC whistleblower, who was trumped up much more than they were, hyped up more than they deserve to be. But Facebook has responded by calling for new internet standards, and they are kind of ceding to at least part of this agenda. They're calling for standard rules for the internet. We can throw that statement up. But basically, Facebook's director of policy communications, attacks Haugen and then says, despite all this, we all agree on one thing. It's time to begin to create standard rules for the internet. It's been 25 years since the rules for the internet have been updated. And instead of expecting the industry to make societal decisions that belong to legislators, it is time for Congress to act. So Facebook is not entirely opposed to what Congress is pushing here.
Yeah, and Max, you said a comment earlier about how there are, of course, problems with Facebook and other big tech social media corporations amplifying certain content. I agree 100%. They constantly amplify CNN. They constantly amplify MSNBC, CIA, MSNBC, CIA. They constantly amplify Western government propaganda while censoring anything that challenges Western corporate media narratives. I want to remind people that Facebook's so-called fact-checking team, a few years ago, they hired the Weekly Standard to help them fact check on the platform. For people who don't know, the Weekly Standard is one of the most notoriously pro-war neoconservative rags out there. I mean, this is like a Bill Kristol website, and Facebook was working with them on so-called fact checking. So yeah, I agree. I agree with this so-called whistleblower. Facebook definitely has a problem with amplifying fake news. Yeah, amplifying fake news around WMDs and all the other CIA lies and misinformation today.
Well, I mean, Facebook also hired the Atlantic Council and its DFR lab, which is essentially a US and UK intelligence contractor to verify content and advise it on which content to purge from its platform immediately after Trump was elected and the Russiagate narrative kicked in. So I think we're just witnessing an extension of that agenda. I think the Weekly Standard, which is dead now, was brought in to kind of appease conservatives because Facebook was going to be targeting the populist right, which the Weekly Standard opposes and which hates the Weekly Standard because it's a neocon rag. But the Atlantic Council is a much more insidious and powerful force. We've talked about it constantly. It's NATO's unofficial think tank in Washington. And at the time, they had a character named Ben Nimmo who was running around purging or advising the social media companies, Twitter and Facebook, on which Russian bots to purge. And they were purging real people like this pensioner, Ian something from the UK, and a famous Ukrainian concert pianist named Val Lisitsa, who was opposed to the nationalist Western-backed government in Kiev. These were all removed because Ben Nimmo decided they were bots and not real people. So he's a complete fraud. And I mean, it's hard to even keep track of the amount of censorship that's taking place on Facebook. Friends of ours like Lee Camp say that they are blocked from receiving new likes. When, like at Redacted Tonight, Lee's show, he cannot receive new likes on his Facebook page. We are definitely suppressed on Facebook, although it remains a consistent source of traffic for the gray zone. I don't even participate in Facebook anymore. It's just a complete trash can. I can't even figure out what's going on. Ben somehow like never sleeps, or there's he cloned himself 5 times. He's a transhumanist because he manages to participate in Facebook and be prolific on Instagram and Twitter and contribute articles to the gray zone and be here. So I don't know how he does it, but Facebook, I would love to see the whole thing obliterated, but clearly there's another agenda: counter espionage, massive censorship, possibly removing Section 230, more government regulation, but the bad kind of government regulation where it's not nationalized or made a public utility like the phone company. It just means that the people in government who put Frances Haugen up to this testimony get to decide what we see and can post on Facebook. That seems to be the agenda here. And then the proposal of new internet standards means this is a sweeping agenda. This is a pivot point in human history, I would say, where we're moving into a kind of a great reset. And I know that term connotes has conspiratorial implications, but the great reset is a real agenda being pushed by the World Economic Forum, the same outfit that provides sort of this de facto home for global capitalism that conceived the phrase build back better, which has been grafted on everything from Boris Johnson's political campaign for re-election to Joe Biden's infrastructure plan. And it is about infiltrating multinational institutions and the internet itself with so-called corporate stakeholderism. So the corporate stakeholders get to have a seat at the table at the United Nations, at the World Health Organization, at all these multinational decision-making bodies. And then these global bureaucrats go and graft their policies onto municipalities and nations. It's essentially an anti-democratic recipe. And with it comes the introduction of digital currency through central banks and the a massive censorship agenda and social credit, where your behavior is linked to your ability to participate in society through your smartphone. And we're seeing that play out in Canada right now. But what's interesting here, and I want to go back to Frances Haugen before introducing this concept that the World Economic Forum has been attempting to popularize of the cyber pandemic or an infodemic. What's interesting here is that Frances Haugen made very eerie comments about Facebook being taken down for 5 hours. And Ben, if you could play that real quick, I think it would be really illustrative.
So this is the clip from the Congressional hearing. Here we go.
They won't solve this crisis without your help. Yesterday, we saw Facebook get taken off the internet. I don't know why it went down, but I know that for more than 5 hours, Facebook wasn't used to deepen divides, destabilize democracies, and make young girls and women feel bad about their bodies. It also means that millions of small businesses weren't able to reach potential customers, and countless photos of new babies weren't joyously celebrated by family and friends around the world. I believe in the potential of Facebook. We can have social media we enjoy that connects us without tearing apart our democracy, putting our children in danger, and sowing ethnic violence around the world.
Okay, so
Do better.
yeah, we can do better. So she's just, I mean, first of all, she's not calling for blowing up Facebook. She's like, we can do better. She makes this reference to ethnic violence around the world, which could also be a reference to the fear the ruling elite in the US had of Black Lives Matter. But
she hit all the talking points.
The talking points, but the key one here,
the official enemies supposedly stoking ethnic violence and specifically destabilizing democracies. You know, neocons love terms like that. They're destabilizing our democracy. We have to do something because our so-called democracy is at threat.
Right. But the weirdest part was that she mentioned the takedown of Facebook, and she said, of course, I don't know why it went down, but the timing was serendipitous. I mean, the timing could not have been better for the talking point where she wanted to illustrate what was lost with Facebook going out, and the entire public was prepared in a dramatic way for her testimony because they were forced to recognize how dependent they were on Facebook.
Well, and its products. Because I want to underscore this point again. A lot of people don't realize not only does Facebook own Instagram, it also owns WhatsApp. And in the US, WhatsApp is not like a very popular app, but especially in a lot of in the global South and Latin America and other places, WhatsApp is like the most popular app. Billions of people use WhatsApp. I think more people use WhatsApp than Facebook. And in Latin America, basically everyone I talk to uses WhatsApp, and almost no one uses texting. They all use WhatsApp. And the fact that Facebook owns WhatsApp and uses it to spy on people, by the way, and the fact that WhatsApp went down meant that that millions of people couldn't talk to their loved ones and friends, and also businesses. A lot of businesses, like the big cable companies, like Claro and other companies like that, they all use WhatsApp, and that all went down. It shows how much Facebook is like part of the global economic infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, that affected us. We all communicate there with our journalistic colleagues and associates, and I was like, okay, got to go back to email. It was like using a typewriter. So it did provide this kind of wake up call for people around the world. And it wasn't just Facebook. Other programs and apps went down. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, StreamYard went down for several hours. And this meant, the podcast class was left alone in their little basements without any way of communicating with people or their audiences. It felt targeted to me. I haven't really received a plausible explanation, but her comments there raise another red flag. And it's here that I want to kind of introduce this concept of the infodemic or the cyber pandemic. I think cyber pandemic is closer to what was experienced briefly, and what the World Economic Forum and its partners in the national security state globally, I mean, in national security states in countries across the world, in the tech sector, the financial sector, what they're preparing for. There was a simulation actually carried out by the World Economic Forum and its various partners called Cyber Polygon. You could throw this up on screen. There's Cyber Polygon 2020 and Cyber Polygon 2021. It recalls distinctly the 2019 simulation presided over by the Gates Foundation with World Economic Forum and government participation, called Event 201, which forecasted a pandemic and provided the blueprint that we've seen enacted in real time since pandemic was declared months later. Now, I'm not saying that there is some conspiracy to cause a pandemic, or there is a conspiracy to cause a cyber pandemic. It's just very clear that these kind of crises are inevitable. Whitney Webb has a great piece about this simulation out at Unlimited Hangout, and I'll just highlight some takeaways from her piece, which I think will suggest, I think she really nailed it on where all of this is going, where this whole internet censorship agenda is going, and how it's moving towards a much more far-reaching, holistic, and permanent agenda of imposing elite control on Western societies and replacing these outmoded quasi-liberal democracies with a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, a digital dictatorship with a democratic veneer. So the World Economic Forum carried out this event first, and really significantly, with Russia's Sberbank and its cybersecurity subsidiary. Why is this significant? Because we just had this gigantic freak out in the US over Russian hacking. There were all these rejections of Russian efforts to partner with the US on cybersecurity. But here you have a gigantic event at a place where, John Kerry travels there to promote efforts against climate change. Tony Blair was a participant in Cyber Polygon 2021. And what they're warning about is kind of what took place last week. A single vulnerable link, or this week, a single vulnerable link is enough to bring down the entire system, just like the domino effect. And so they're calling for a secure approach to digital development today that will determine the future of humanity for decades to come. Now, this was carried out in partnership with a Russian bank that is majority owned by the Russian state and a Russian cybersecurity arm. So, and an Interpol and IBM also participated. So first of all, it really highlights how the Russiagate narrative was purely for public consumption, while in private, the architects of the new Cold War knew that they would be partnering with Russia at some point on advancing this digital fourth industrial revolution, or what we could call a great reset. For Russia, it was an effort to get back into the good graces of the so-called global community, because why wouldn't they, after being demonized so unfairly and sanctioned during the Trump era? And the whole event took place without any outrage from the Rachel Maddow crowd or the Biden administration, which we know is filled with Russophobic figures. So it's obviously, its importance obviously transcends anything related to U.S.-Russia relations. And what it focused on was the cyber pandemic, which outlets like the New Yorker, as Whitney Webb pointed out, claim is already underway. Now, it's not just the New Yorker warning about this crisis that's coming our way. The head of Israel's National Cyber Directorate, who's someone who comes out of Israel's Unit 8200, which is Israel's research and development and cyber hacker unit that created the Stuxnet virus. Yuval Una warned last year that a cyber winter of cyber attacks is coming, and coming faster than even I expected. And we can turn to the SolarWinds hack, which was blamed on Russia, as an example, along with the ransomware attacks on the Colonial Pipeline, which briefly shut down the supply of fuel across the East Coast here in Washington, D.C. It wasn't that much of an inconvenience, but I could only buy regular gasoline. The premium gasoline was sold out, and several gas stations were emptied out of their supply for like 2 or 3 days. But this is just a preview of what's to come in an economy and a political system that is going to be completely digitized. And when you have these crisis level events, well, just look at all of the new, some would call draconian measures that have been imposed under quasi-emergency law during the current pandemic, and consider what could take place during a cyber pandemic, which the World Economic Forum and all of its global partners are already preparing for. So I think we should really look at this week as a preview of what's to come, as a real turning point. I think we're at an inflection point, and something deeply disturbing is just over the horizon.
And there's another element of this. It's especially ironic considering you brought up Russiagate, and considering how just a year ago, 2 years ago, there was such an obsession with demonizing Russia and portraying Russia as the root of all of these problems. And that is a scandal, a kind of a brief media scandal, but a scandal you might remember that was all over the corporate media when it was, in the national consciousness for however long the U.S. national attention span is. How long can a story last? A week, 2 weeks? But do you all remember Cambridge Analytica? There was wall-to-wall, 24/7 coverage. And the narrative was that this company that was linked to the Donald Trump campaign, which, it was linked to the Donald Trump campaign, and this billionaire who backed him, that it supposedly helped Russia steal the election on behalf of Donald Trump, which is absolutely absurd. And then there was this very weird whistleblower who came out, again, a so-called whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica, Christopher Wylie. Remember, he had pink hair and he was like this vegan punk. Well, he was the one who helped bolster these conspiracies that Russia had been using Cambridge Analytica to steal the election. And here we are. You can see on the right here, it's Christopher Wylie with his pink hair. And he was, for a few weeks, maybe you can say a few months, he was like a kind of media celebrity, right? Like this current so-called whistleblower, Francis Haugen. Well, as our friend Alexander Rubinstein pointed out in this piece, that story ended up being totally bogus, like pretty much all of Russiagate. And as he summarizes it here, so-called whistleblower Christopher Wylie from Cambridge Analytica and neoconservative The Guardian reporter Carol Cadwallader, they earned film deals and flashy awards by blaming Brexit and Trump on a sweeping conspiracy supposedly between data firm Cambridge Analytica and Russia. A British government investigation shatters their claim to fame. So what happened is the British government conducted a months-long investigation. In fact, I think it was a years-long investigation into this, and they found zero evidence. Here's what this so-called whistleblower, Christopher Wylie, claimed. When I was at Cambridge Analytica, the company hired known Russian agents who had data researchers in St. Petersburg. Ooh. And they tested US voter opinion on Putin's leadership and hired hackers from Russia, all while former Trump chief of staff Steve Bannon was in charge. Now, he also wrote this book, Mindfuck, Cambridge Analytica and the Plot to Break America. And I love how they can never say fuck, so they have to put like an asterisk, Mindfuck, and it's seen as like, oh, he said a swear word, he's cool, he's badass. And it became an Oscar shortlisted Netflix documentary called The Great Hack. In fact, Christopher Wylie, out of nowhere, this so-called whistleblower, it earned him a spot on Time Magazine's 100 most influential people list. And you can bet that if we hear more of the so-called whistleblower from Facebook, Frances Haugen, she'll get included on these influential people lists for a few weeks, and then she'll be forgotten a few months later.
You can see they each have an image that's intended to be relatable for a certain group of a certain group, the kind of group that like Facebook would target. Like they both relate to micro-targeting groups. Frances Haugen, sort of, suburban white women who are disgusted by their daughters being on Instagram all day, looking at this degrading influencer content and emulating it. Christopher Wylie, he's sort of a punk, he's what do they call him? The gay Canadian vegan. So
he called himself proudly a gay Canadian vegan who somehow ended up creating Steve Bannon's psychological warfare mindfuck tool, who enjoys a wild ride from fashion to fascism to fashion. And Alex points out that after starting out as a fashion school student, he said he was hired by H&M. This fashion guy with pink hair.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of a different era because it was the Trump era. It was about the introduction of figures like Christopher Wylie. Obviously such a fraud. I mean, he eventually did events with Bill Browder and just revealed what a clown he was, but it was about getting progressives, and particularly young progressives, on board with the new Cold War. And it worked in some case, in some cases. I mean, I remember a lot of like the left, like what we consider the left in the US, was on board with Russiagate and was, gleeful about the P tape and the Steele dossier just because it was about getting Trump. But where did that wind us up?
Well, and then this also leads to the whole red-brown thing, because Christopher Wylie, who's got this kind of like anarcho regime change politics, he was helping push this narrative that Russia is supporting fascism and all this, which very neatly dovetails with NATO propaganda. But anyway, the point is, as this article at the Gray Zone pointed out, this is from 2020, so this is pretty recent news. As this points out, the British government conducted an investigation, and it was conducted by Elizabeth Denham, the UK information commissar. Sorry, I mean information commissioner. Russia has commissars. The great Western democracies have commissioners. And anyway, they conducted this investigation, and the British Information Office, and they produced a report that contradicted virtually every major prediction and assertion that Wylie and this neoconservative The Guardian journalist Cadwallader made about Cambridge Analytica and its supposed role in UK politics, published this October. So this was published in October of 2020, a year ago. The British government report their investigation found no evidence of Russian meddling. So again, this is from the UK Information Commissioner's Office. They spent over 2 years investigating Cambridge Analytica, and including its parent company, SCL, Strategic Communication Laboratories. They found no evidence of Russia supposedly hacking the vote and hacking the minds of Britain so they would vote in support of Russiagate. Vote in support of Brexit. So just a year ago, we can see how quickly people just totally shift and do a 180. You can't. you can't overestimate how short people's attention spans are. For me, this is what's so incredible about this, is because we go from every few months, there's all these scandal. We go from scandal to scandal. And then people are so upset for a few weeks, and then it goes to another one and they totally forget. And they might even do a whole 180. And we're supposed to believe that that Russia is hacked our minds and forced people to vote for Trump. And then they forced British people to vote for Brexit. And then now Facebook is being used by Iran to spy on Israel. So we have to, I mean, it's so clearly manipulative.
Yeah. And Elizabeth Denham was actually praised by Christopher Wylie before she introduced that damning report. But the thing about Russiagate or any of the other sort of manufactured crises that we've been introduced to is that whenever official disinformation is corrected in public view, it's always buried. So it's either buried in an article in the 15th paragraph, in a small disclosure of a editor's note that the entire article was false, but they can't retract it. Or you have a report like this, which barely generates any attention. That's why I wanted Alex to do this article at the Gray Zone, and we worked so hard on it. It was so important to get that on the record, that this entire narrative about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook was basic, and them colluding with Russia and Steve Bannon. And I mean, it was all about, Bannon's mindfuck psycho weapon was completely bogus. And that what Cambridge Analytica was doing was what pretty much every other company does with micro-targeting. And if anything, it wasn't very good at it. It was a victim of its own hype. And no one reported on it. No one cared. The damage was already done. Hillary Clinton promoted Christopher Wylie, and Carol Cadwalladr won all these awards, even as she was kind of covertly working with the Integrity Initiative, which is a British intelligence operation that we've exposed at the Gray Zone. And everybody just moved on. And it'll be the same with this latest Facebook whistleblower op and everything else that we expose at the Gray Zone. The whole rest of the media just moves on. I want to address a few comments that I've been reading. One asked if I'm still living in Senator Richard Blumenthal's house. I've never been to Senator Richard Blumenthal's house, and he's not my dad. Number two, I saw some comments about, people feeling very bleak about my comments on the coming cyber pandemic, or the likelihood of a cyber pandemic. And I think, you shouldn't feel hopeless. It should just help illustrate what problems we should focus on and where the focal points of resistance should be. And right now in Washington, there is a huge debate that almost feels phony to me about Biden's Build Back Better infrastructure plan, where these two right-wing Democrats, Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, have been made into villains. And in many ways, they are just villainous corporate tools, because they're holding up Biden's agenda here, and the Republicans are trying to winnow out all this public spending in the infrastructure program. But buried in that program, which is named after an agenda that the World Economic Forum initially rolled out as part of its fourth industrial revolution agenda, are the creation of smart grids, smart electric grids, smart cities, smart transportation hubs. And what that means is everything becomes digitized to enable surveillance on an unprecedented scale and to make virtually inevitable a cyber pandemic. That's not a conspiracy to have a cyber pandemic. It's just a byproduct of the new digital system. And we're also seeing the introduction of digital passports or digital IDs through the current pandemic, which will enable surveillance on a mass scale, as well as massive wealth for graduating upwards. I mean, this is playing out in front of our eyes. It is the agenda of global capitalism. It is to de-democratize our societies and keep us in a constant cascading cycle of crises where they grab more wealth and more control. And so it's important to just be aware of the various simulations and to understand where the focal points of resistance should be, rather than just being hopeless and feeling completely powerless. And here, I mean, I don't know if Ben, you want to add anything, but I think we should transition to the Pandora Papers because it completely ties in with the conversation we've been having.
Yeah, I think in our previous stream last week, we talked about the hysteria over what is very likely a totally fabricated Havana Syndrome.
Yeah.
This claim without any evidence whatsoever that supposedly there's this massive emergency and that CIA spies and State Department diplomats and Pentagon shills are being attacked with like some 22nd century Russian ray gun that's like from Minority Report, or like it doesn't even exist, but we're supposed to believe that somehow like Cuba and Vietnam and China and all of the targets of the US empire are like using some like radio wave technology to attack US diplomats. We talked about that in our previous stream, and how actual scientists, including scientists who work with the US government internally, admitted that there's no evidence for this whatsoever, that it's scientifically implausible, if not impossible, and that the most likely cause of this so-called Havana Syndrome is psychogenic, that is psychological, it's psychosocial. And I think so much of what we're seeing now, and especially around social media, is trying to fan the flames of this digital hysteria to create this idea that there's a massive social crisis that requires a massive crackdown by the government. And it's so similar to disaster capitalism again and again, right? And ironically, the figure who helped popularize that term, disaster capitalism, herself was kind of taken over and subsumed by that same system. I'm talking about Naomi Klein, who has very much become part of that kind of like left liberal, mainstream, pro-imperialist blob who, anyway, that's a whole other story.
And Shoshana Zuboff, who coined the term surveillance capitalism. She's part of that crowd as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, we see that anytime there's any of these emergencies or crises like the pandemic, and that's not in any way to suggest that like they were created in any way, but capital and the capitalist class, billionaires, Wall Street, the military industrial complex, the war machine always take advantage of these crises and use it to push through all of these agendas that they had. And of course, we have 9/11, the Gulf of Tonkin, we have so many different incidents. And I think now, you know, with the threat, a so-called threat of cyber attacks and all of this, and I actually have a new article coming out at the Gray Zone about how NATO is now engaging in what it calls cognitive warfare. We're going to talk about that. I plan on talking about that in a future stream in my article, because it really shows that the future of war is not only against more and more, it's not only against foreign countries, but increasingly against domestic populations. More and more, NATO explicitly, the Western NATO military cartel and the US government itself, more and more, they see their own domestic populations as the biggest so-called threat. This NATO report on cognitive warfare that I did a report on at the Gray Zone, we're going to publish soon, they actually claim in their NATO-sponsored report that there are so-called fifth columns in Western so-called liberal democracies who are threatening the stability of Western democracy. And of course, the implication is that they have to be uprooted and removed, the so-called fifth columns. So
yeah,
and it's all part of this hysteria.
Yeah, on 9/11, a new DHS report was introduced labeling as a terror threat despite no actual threat. Those who question official pandemic policy. And so new fifth columns are being added constantly, but we hear these terms about fifth columnists. In the UK, it destroyed the career of Jeremy Corbyn, anti-Semite, anyone who questions official policy on Israel-Palestine. So yeah, that it's a frightening report. We're going to publish by Ben, and it just has to go through the editorial pipeline. And I don't know, we don't have as much resources as The Intercept to publish pieces, but we do publish pieces people actually read, unlike them. So.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a pause there and continue this discussion in part 2. In the second half, we're going to talk about the Pandora Papers and how the organization behind the Pandora Papers, this so-called leak of documents that just so happened to leave out U.S. politicians and U.S. billionaires. Well, the organization behind this is actually funded by CIA cutouts and Western billionaires and works closely with other organizations that are really regime change groups that are funded by the United States government. So definitely join us in part 2, talking about the Pandora Papers and the media and other aspects of the information war that is being waged around the world, not only against foreign nations, but also increasingly at home in so-called Western liberal democracies. If you want to support this show, of course, you can go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels, and you can find a lot of exclusive content. So please consider supporting us there. And we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.